Hello, my name is Matthew, and last night I watched a new vsauce video. Vsauce is one of my favorite old YouTube channels. It was one of the first and one of the best videos channels. It's created by Michael Stevens, and he makes these videos that are entertaining and informative and crucially thought provoking. He comes up with seemingly absurd questions as a vehicle to have a very creative, thoughtful, engaging discussion. Things like the shadow have a weight, and things like that, where it seems like the question doesn't make any sense, but he interrogates and investigates the subject and comes up with lots of entertaining, fun, interesting things to communicate and talk about. And last night, his newest video, the subject was did people in the past age faster? And he goes in a whole array of different subjects looking at that topic from different angles. And eventually he starts talking about dreams and this idea that it was documented for hundreds of years that people would say that they dreamt in color. And then at the invention of black and white television, there was this this generation that started having a higher proportion of documentations that people were dreaming in black and white. And then color television came about, and people started reverting back to having color dreams, or at least thinking they were having colored dreams. But that generation that first had an association with black and white television, as they got older and as the decades passed and color television was the dominant force, they retained having this idea of having black and white dreams. And Michael in the video then thinks about other kinds of media and brings up this really interesting question, which is why I'm making this video now. Do people read in black and white or color? Now, I don't think that I do either, because I've never had the experience reading a book where I have a literal motion picture going through my mind. But I do have atmospheric color associations, maybe not so much while I'm actually reading, but certainly in my remembrances and in the way that I talk about certain books. I do have these evocations that some specific books have colors or atmospheres that, in my experience, have become closely tied together. And I have a bunch of examples of different books. These are, I think the main reason why I have very close associations with the books I'm going to show is that they are some of my, if not favorite, some of my most familiar books. I've spent a lot of time with these authors and specific works. And the first book that I could have possibly had a black and white reading experience with, the only thing that I could really think about was maybe Sherlock Holmes, because I've watched so many of those old black and white movies and television programs. But when I think about Sherlock Holmes, I don't really think about color at all. There's everything else going on in the story. But this was one work that I thought maybe, after thinking about it for a little bit, I don't think about those black and white characters. I don't think about the actors that was playing Sherlock or Watson, and so I don't make those associations. Now, some authors that the idea of black and white could maybe come close to, the first being Dostoevsky, and I'll hold up the Karamazov brothers. And it's not so much that I have these black and white associations, it's that very specific chiaroscuro effect where when I think about these characters and the settings that they inhabit, I really do imagine these dark caverns with very sparse lighting, maybe coming through a window or a candle, just flickering and shining certain segments of flesh or objects that are emerging out of the darkness. And that's an association that I have just very clear ties with Dostoevsky and pretty much all of his novels and short stories. This idea of light emerging out of darkness. Kind of along the same lines would be the short stories of Edgar Allan Poe, that macabre feeling. Of course, this is with most of these works, that those evocations, not entirely, but the majority of the reason is actually, of course, the subject matter, the atmosphere that's being described in the book. But I do have that same sort of very dark, macabre feeling with Edgar Allan Poe, of course. Then there are two writers that I'll show, Samuel Beckett and I'm holding up the trial, but Kafka. The short stories, plays, novels, I'm mostly generally speaking about the author's body of work or what I've read by them. And for Kafka, it's that claustrophobic feeling, interior spaces that are uncomfortable, have unnecessary restrictions, and I often read that while I'm reading it, but it's one of the main things that I probably talk about when I think about Kafka is that constrained claustrophobic feeling. And now, Beckett has a very similar atmosphere in his books, but they can also still be open air. And so instead of a claustrophobic feeling, now it's more of a feeling of desolation. The idea that you can still be in a claustrophobic environment, just out in the open, but the open range is still a barren wasteland. And there are atmospheric feelings that you can get in these Beckett stories. Like if there's a description that you don't know whether or not it's daytime or nighttime, that's a detail that's in one of his plays that just pulls through. It's a mental association that I have with Beckett that runs through all of his work. And I also thought it'd be interesting to show some counterpoints to some of the examples that I'm showing, because it really is a rare experience. I don't often have very specific atmospheric feelings that are sentimentally tied to my associations with the book. You can find those details in the text, but there's a lot of books that I read that I can just understand, well, okay, now we're describing something, instead of a visceral interior feeling that is kind of laid on top of the experience of the book. And so things like Edgar Allan Poe, Dostoevsky, Kafka, Samuel Beckett, these books where there's an additional level of specific atmosphere that I have. I have Celine here, and just Death on Credit. And it's another dark, despairing, cynical work. It's indicative of the author's entire body of work, Death on Credit. But instead of having that sort of atmosphere or that feeling that I would maybe want to talk about if if I was holding up this book. Instead, one of the chief characteristics of Celine is actually the violence of his voice, which I don't have a mental picture of a voice. With Dostoevsky, a really close comparison might be Tolstoy. They were contemporaries, writing these great big books, set around the same time. And of course, they're totally different. There's no real reason to compare these two writers. But in this case, I just wanted to point out that I don't have any sort of lighting or atmospheric or color feelings with Tolstoy compared to Dostoevsky, which it's just absolutely tied to the work for me. Another comparison. So most of the works by Balzac, I have Cousin Bet that I want to hold up, and this is really an author whose works give me a very specific kind of lighting. This is a world set by flame, by fireplace and lanterns and candles. I always imagine those red flickers on the walls and shadows that are moving by the open flames. And whether it's described in the book, but all of the other descriptions, the actor, the characters, the atmosphere, the action, everything just always feels like steeped in candlelight, and it's absolutely beautiful. And then, as a counterpoint, Dickens, which I don't really have any sort of very close association the way that I do with Balzac, except that the idea of coal and sootiness and gray and browns that are closer to just how most of the works are described, instead of that interior feeling that I have when I think back. I have that with Balzac. Lives set by candlelight. Not so much with Dickens. Two others that have, a few others that have some more specific feelings that are evoked when I think about the atmosphere and coloring of the world. Most of the works by Oscar Wilde. So short stories, all of the plays, Picture of Dorian Gray. I'm holding up the major works. Not everything, but the majority of Oscar Wilde. I just have that. These people reclining in their drawing rooms with daylight and sunshine just bathing through the windows. These interior spaces that are just filled with sunshine coming through window panes. Pleasant, comfortable. That certain kind of sunshine that when you look into a room and you see those huge rectangular panels of light splashing across the wallpaper, or the colored painted walls, that feeling that you're just sitting and luxuriating in daytime and sunshine, and it's enjoyable and pleasant and comfortable. Very similar as far as daylight and sunshine would be the early works. I'm mostly thinking about the short stories, early short stories by Truman Capote. I have the Grass Harp here. But instead of that interior daylight, it's very much that youthful, childlike hope and dream of those pleasant, sunny summer days. It doesn't even have to be summer. There's still that romance of winter snowstorm where it's still pleasant outside and the snow doesn't feel quite so cold or bitter, where you can go out and play. And it's the days when you're a child that you want to go out and play. That setting, that feeling, I really get that sense in those short stories. Just tramping off in the world with not a care to be had. And then again, a counterpoint would be To Kill a Mockingbird by Harper Lee, which, as far as action and subject matter and even tone, there's a lot of similarities, but I don't have that specific feeling that I get with Truman Capote. Now, I don't think that I have two more counter examples. I don't think that sort of feeling is necessary or even incredibly important in the idea that something is of a favorite or a great work or anything like that. I think it's a very personal association that you can make with any book that just strikes a chord. And so two others, Daphne, that I want to show is I just read Mrs. Dalloway, but this is To the Lighthouse by Virginia Woolf, which is full, a lot of Virginia Woolf's fiction can be full of this very clear, beautiful, luxurious descriptions of the world, a lot of color, details. But it's not what I think about when I think about the works of Virginia Woolf. And the last book I think I'll show is The Magic Mountain. I've read it a few times. It has a dramatic, specific setting, that sanitarium up in the Swiss Alps, and there are beautiful descriptions of the landscape, but there's just so much more going on in this book for me to pay attention to as I'm reading it and think about after I've read it, and try to communicate, if I'm talking about The Magic Mountain, that the atmosphere, whatever mental picture that I might have, does not become a personal, visceral feeling that I have when I think about or talk about The Magic Mountain. And I would say that for the most of the things that I read, I don't have very specific atmospheric, color-oriented feelings. Surely not black and white in color, but I think it's a really interesting conversation. I'd be very interested to know if anyone, when they're reading, reads in black and white. I think that would be interesting. Or if you really do have mental motion pictures that are in color as you're reading. I don't believe that I do. So anyway, a whole bunch of books, interesting idea. I'll leave a link to Vsauce's new video. All of his videos are just that, conversations about really interesting ideas. So thank you for watching. Please leave a comment if you would like, and take care. Bye. Andy?